Willkommen in einem anderen Aufregendes Video, or welcome to yet another exciting video. In this case we will look at a number of episodes of Star Trek, the original series, or possibly generation, to identify key historical references which can be used to determine the original history of the Star Trek universe timeline. The episode order I am using is the production order. Episodes 1 to 6 are covered in this video. In order to understand the development of the history or vision, we need to study the episodes in the order they were written. While I'm uncertain of the exact writing order, the production order is about as close as I can confirm. The episode order as broadcast is also included. Special thanks to the transcripts which can be found on the Geschichte site. When Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek back in 1966, he had a vision which remained basically consistent. When The Next Generation was released in 1987, Gene's vision had changed, and the past needed to change in order to be consistent with this new vision. This video series will look at the original vision of Star Trek, starting with the earlier source material. Any historical facts from later sources which contradict the earlier references will be assumed to be in error. Minor changes in nomenclature can be excused. The Cage is the first pilot episode. It was the first episode produced, but was never formally broadcast. We learn in this episode a survey ship, the SS Columbia, was exploring this region of space 18 years ago. The best guess is this episode occurred in 2254, so the SS Columbia was lost in 2236 in the Talos star group. I'm uncertain where the reference comes from, but her designation is NC 59401. Quote, Tyler states, I have a fix, it comes from the Talos star group. Number 1 replies, we've no ships or Earth colonies that far out. Spock then states, their call letters check with a survey expedition, SS Columbia. It disappeared in this region approximately 18 years ago. The image in the bottom left is a guess of what the SS Columbia may have looked like. The Talos group, which I assume to be the Talos star group, is a solar system. Spock states, records show the Talos group has never been explored. Solar system similar to Earth, 11 planets. Number 4 seems to be Class M, oxygen atmosphere. The screen shown here shows the classification of some of the planets, with Class M having an oxygen atmosphere. Additional data about Class M planet is provided by the geologist. The geologist states 0.9 of Earth. The location of the Talos group is a long way from Earth, but is unlikely to be on the other side of the galaxy, as stated by Pike. Pike states, my name is Christopher Pike, commander of the Space Vehicle Enterprise from a stellar group at the other end of the galaxy. The Vega Colony is mentioned, which is the destination of the Enterprise. It must be an advanced colony in order to provide medical assistance. It must have sufficient facilities in order to provide crew replacements. Pike states the following. Pike, continue to the Vega Colony and take care of our own sick and injured first. And afterwards, I'm glad you do, because we're going to stop first at the Vega Colony and replace anyone who needs hospitalization. Rigel 7 was the last planet visited by the Enterprise in this episode. This was a planet which was generally unknown. Pike states, oh, I should have smelled trouble when I saw the swords and armour. Instead of that, I let myself get trapped in that deserted fortress and attacked by one of their warriors. The other key point is it's not called a colony, thus it's unlikely to be a colony or even part of the Federation. The episode does mention warp drive, but the terminology was unusual. The speed was described as time warp factor 7 rather than warp factor 7. It was also implied that hyperspace was entered when this occurred. Pike states, this is the captain, our destination is the Talos star group, our time warp factor 7. Spock then states later in the episode, this is the acting captain speaking. We have no choice now but to consider the safety of this vessel and the remainder of the crew. We are leaving. All decks prepare for hyperdrive, time warp factor. We are introduced to an alien race in this episode, the Talosians. The Talosians communicate telepathically. They had a war thousands of centuries ago and live underground, where they developed their mental powers. Spock states, the inhabitants of this planet must live deep underground and probably manufacture food and other needs down there. Our tests indicate the planet's surface without considerably more vegetation or animals is simply too barren to support life. Later, Pike and Vina provide more information. Why did they go underground? Vina replied, war thousands of centuries ago. The Talosians who came underground found life limiting there, and they concentrated on developing their mental powers. Regulus is a planet which Pike was considering setting up a business on. It's probably not a colony, but may have been an Earth colony at one stage, but was no longer classed as a colony now, or it could have even been an alien inhabited planet. The latter is unlikely, as living on a non-human planet may not be viable unless there's large numbers of humans on there already. Imagine a human setting up a hot dog stand on Vulcan. We get another colony in the episode, Orion Colony. Pike states, "I might go in business on Regulus or on the Orion Colony." Boyce replies, "You, an Orion trader, dealing in green animal women slaves?" Orion Colony has green slave women who like to be taken advantage of, apparently. An officer in one of Pike's dreams states, "Funny how they are on this planet. They actually like being taken advantage of." So in summary, while there is no mention of the Federation, Starfleets or photon torpedoes, we can assume they exist. While deflector shields are not mentioned, a meteorite beam is, which could be the same thing. The Enterprise is part of the United Spaceship Fleet. Earth has a number of colonies, Vega and Orion. In addition, Pike can set up business on Regulus, which is most likely a human planet, which may no longer have a status of colony, may actually be a Federation member planet. We discover Earth was sending out survey ships a significant distance from Earth. Why no ship went out looking for the SS Columbia when it was lost is not explained, but distance could have been a reason. As the Enterprise can reach warp factor 7, it's assumed 18 years prior the speeds were a lot less. One guess for how far the Enterprise is from the closest Earth base is 6 weeks at warp 7. If the speeds were 10 times less, then it would take possibly 60 weeks or more than a year in order to achieve this distance. However, the main reason was it must have lost FTL communication capabilities, thus it could not inform anyone it was in trouble. This actually occurs in later episodes of Star Trek, so possibly is the best scenario or theory. The episode also identifies 2 alien planets, Talos and Rigel 7. One interesting point is the Enterprise travels 18 light years at warp factor 7 to reach Talos. The actual time spent is not mentioned, but it may have been significant. Using a total wild guess, assuming each season represents 1 year of a 5-year mission, then each episode represents about 2 weeks of time each. It's possible the distance was covered in 2 weeks, which gives the Enterprise the ability to travel 450 times the speed of light at warp factor 7. The time spent travelling could have been much greater, which is why the decision to head that way was made only after the second message. But even if it was 4 weeks, this still represents an impressive speed. Where No Man Has Gone Before is the 3rd episode of the 1st season. It was the 2nd episode produced and actually was the 2nd pilot. Its stardate is 1312.4 and its original air date was 22nd of September 1966. While at no time does this episode mention Vulcan, we know Spock is not human because he lacks emotion, also has unusual ears. He claims one of his ancestors was a human female. Spock states his lack of emotions. Irritating, ah yes, one of your Earth's emotions. Spock then later states, the fact one of my ancestors married a human female. The SS Valiant was an early impulse-drive starship which explored the edge of the galaxy and was caught in a magnetic storm and encountered a strange barrier, after which it was destroyed. The estimate is that the Valiant was destroyed in 2061 or 2063, or most likely 2065. This episode is assumed to be occurring in 2264. We know the SS Valiant used impulse drive, but this must be a type of impulse drive which allows it to travel faster than light. Quote, Kirks states, "This is the captain speaking. The object we encountered is a ship's disaster recorder, apparently ejected from the SS Valiant 200 years ago." Spock then later states, "The Valiant had encountered a magnetic space storm and was being swept in this direction." Kirk replies, "The old impulse engines weren't strong enough." The SS Valiant may have looked like the ship in the bottom left of the screen. The episode mentions another Earth colony, in this case the Aldebaran colony. Dr. Deneb may have been born, studied, or just met the Enterprise at the colony, so we are uncertain how developed it was. Piper states, "Life sciences ready, sir. This is Dr. Dina, who joined the ship at the Aldebaran colony." The top right is a guess of what Aldebaran 3 looked like. This may have been the Aldebaran colony mentioned in this episode. The SS Valiant was flying out of the galaxy and on the way back encountered a barrier, which damaged the ship, killed some crew members and gave one crew member superhuman powers. This represented some kind of galactic barrier. Spock states, deflectors say there's something there, sensors say there isn't. Density negative, radiation negative, energy negative. Assuming the Enterprise impulse drive was sublight, then there must have been an Earth base reasonably close, which means there is an Earth base close to the galactic barrier. The speed warp which it could achieve is unknown, but if 1 day is equal to 1 year, then we must be dealing with 365 times the speed of light for warp drive. This could be greater or less, but does align with other references. Captain's log, star date 1312.9, ship's condition, heading back on impulse power only, main engines burnt out, the ship's space warp ability gone, Earth bases which were only days away are now years at this distance. Our overriding question now is what destroyed the Valiant. They lived through the barrier just as we have. What happened to them after that? One quick note, we know that early impulse drive could achieve FTL, so possibly the Enterprise was travelling on impulse drive and achieving FTL speeds. On the other hand, perhaps because it had warp drive, the impulse drive that it possessed was a sublight version of impulse drive. There must be different types of impulse drives, both FTL and non-FTL. The episode mentions another planet name, this time Deneb IV. This is probably not a colony, although the women on the planet seem compatible with Earthmen. In the hypersex world of Star Trek, where different species can mate with each other, this may not mean much, but could indicate this was a human planet that was no longer a colony. Kirk states, I've been worried about you since that night on Deneb IV. Michael's replies, yes, she was a nova, that one, not nearly as many after effects this time, especially except for the eyes. The episode mentions another planet, in this case a Delta Vega. The planet is an uninhabited planet, but is a galactic mining station. We assume it's an Earth automated mining post. Kirk states, set course for Delta Vega, stardate 1313.1. We're now approaching Delta Vega, course set for a standard orbit. The planet, completely uninhabited, is slightly smaller than Earth, desolate but rich in crystals and minerals. Kelso's tasks, transport down with a repair party, try to regenerate the main engines, save our ships. Our task, transport down a man I've known for 15 years and if successful, maroon him here. We get yet another planet, this time Demorius. As the inhabitants threw darts at Kirk, it is assumed that this was not an Earth planet and this occurred during an exploration, thus was probably not a Federation planet as well. Michael states, my friend James Kirk, remember those rodent things on Demorius? The poison darts they threw? I took one meant for you. In this episode we see a tombstone and we get to see the birth dates of James R. Kirk, which is 012771. The current star date is 1313.7, which may be wrong as the episode starts at star date 1312.4, so we can't use that date to arrive at a birth date. Later, James' middle name changes to T. I should note in the original series the date looked like 1818.7 rather than 1313.7. An enhanced and tampered version is shown on the bottom left. The estimate here is James T. Kirk is born in 2228. So in summary, while there's still no mention of the Federation, starfleets or photon torpedoes, we can assume they exist. We are first introduced to the phaser rifle in this episode. Earth has a colony, Aldebaran. In addition, Kirk can have an encounter with attractive females on Deneb IV, which may imply it's an Earth planet, but possibly not a colony. It could also be alien, where the aliens are similar to humans. Finally, we have a mining station on Delta Vega, which is almost certainly an Earth mining station. Earth was sending out survey ships a significant distance from Earth an awful long time ago. The SS Valiant, using impulse power, broke through the galactic barrier after which it was destroyed, most likely in 2065, which was before the introduction of the warp drive. We need to understand this carefully. When Zephyr and Cochrane invented warp drive around about 2061 or 2063, Earth was sending impulse-driven spaceships to the galactic edge. This could be as close as 200 light years away, but it represents a massive effort and implies Earth was a powerful spacefaring civilization. This means that First Contact, the movie, released in 1996, is wrong. I would have to assume it returned to a period after one of the global conflicts, well before 2063, and had nothing to do with Zephyr and Cochrane, the warp drive and the Vulcan first contact. The movie would still work, and we can avoid rewriting Star Trek history if we kind of assume this. Later I'll come up with a reasonable theory of where that actual movie fits in, with virtually no changes to the movie except for some minor names. We are also shown an alien planet, which is Demorius. There is a comment where Impulse took years to cover the distance warp could in days. The ratio works reasonably well with other references, especially episode 14. Earth is roughly in the centre of the galactic plane, which means it could be between 400 and 500 light years away from the galactic edge. The SS Valiant would need to travel at least 400 light years, which means it must have FTL drive. I would suggest much slower than warp, which is most likely 400 times the speed of light. But if it was 20 times the speed of light, it could reach the galactic edge in 20 years. This supports the close proximity to an Earth base, but we need to ask ourselves why the barrier was not discovered earlier. It's possible this is how it played out, so why bother to travel to a region where there are no stars or system? But does seem a bit odd. As a matter of interest, the North Galactic Barrier is the closest to Earth at the present moment, so I would assume it was travelling galactic north. Note, the Earth crossed the galactic plane in 2012, moving north. The galactic plane is about 1,000 light years thick on average. That's the thickness of the galaxy at this point. So by 2065, the North Galactic Barrier was less than 500 light years distance, and probably no more than 400 light years distance, and probably a little bit more than 400 light years distance. The Corbomite Maneuver is the 10th episode of Season 1. It was the third episode produced. Its stardate is 1512.2 and its original air date was the 10th of November 1966. In this episode, the Enterprise is using warp speed. The episode shows, or tells us, of a speed of warp 3, but Kirk occasionally lapses into the term warp factor. Kirk states, "Helm, give us warp speed." Sulu replies, "Warp 1, sir." Sulu then adds, "Warp 2, sir. Speed is now warp 3. Later in the episode, Kirk states, "Engage, warp factor 1. The previous episodes mentioned the Enterprise can use impulse. However, in this episode, the term impulse power 2 is used. The term is significant because Kirk uses the term impulse power to describe an impulse speed. There are only a very few episodes where the term impulse power is used with no clarification on what this means, such as in episode 14, The Balance of Terror. Kirk states, "Switch to impulse." Later Kirk states, "Now, Mr. Sulu, impulse power 2. As a result, impulse clearly has different speeds. Presumably, one of those speeds, or some of them, are FTL speeds and others may be sublight speed. During this episode, the ship uses phasers. Kirk states, "Lock phasers on target, Mr. Bailey." "Lock phasers." Bailey replies, "Phasers locked on target, sir, at point blank range and closing." Kirk then orders, "Fire main phasers." Once again during this episode, at no time does the term Vulcan is mentioned. Spock claims Balok was like his father and his mother was a very fortunate Earthwoman. Spock states, "However, it was well played. I regret not having learned more about this Balok. In some manner he was reminiscent of my father." Scott replies, "Then may heaven have helped your mother." Spock states, "Quite the contrary. She considered herself a very fortunate Earth woman." During this episode, we learn of the First Federation and its flagship Fesarius and its commander Balok. Balok speaking, "This is Balok, commander of the flagship Fesarius of the First Federation. Your vessel, obviously the product of a primitive and savage civilization, having ignored a warning buoy and having then destroyed it, has demonstrated your intentions is not peaceful. We will now consider the disposition of your ship and the life aboard." This map comes from a much later source, but which shows the location of the First Federation. No First Federation planet was ever mentioned in this episode, so I'm guessing this is pure speculation. During this episode, hand phaser is mentioned for the first time. In this case, Yeoman Rand uses a hand phaser to warm up some coffee. We do not actually ever see the hand phaser. Rand states, "I use the hand phaser and zap hot coffee." In summary, in this episode we learned Spock's mother was an Earthwoman. Prior to this, we only knew Spock had Earth blood from an ancestor. The Enterprise is using phasers, warp, impulse and deflectors. Warp factor up to 3 are used and impulse power 2 is also used. The use of impulse power 2 is significant as it means when impulse power is stated, it means the speed under impulse drive and some kind of power source. This confirms that some types of impulse drive can provide faster than light speed. The Romulans used this type of drive, and early Earth starships, before warp was invented, did also. We discovered that there is more than one phaser bank with separate crews on the Enterprise. Some of these could be considered as main phasers. This implies there are other phasers elsewhere, either weaker or perhaps pointing to the rear. The hand phaser is now introduced. While we had phaser rifles in the past, this is the first hand phaser used in an episode. Perhaps the most significant new piece of information is the First Federation. This is the first mention of a Federation in Star Trek, and it's specifically called the First Federation. Perhaps this is the precursor to our Federation, or the Earth Federation, although we never see any spaceship like this, like the Fusarius again. While in reality this was probably introduced as a standalone episode idea and never followed up, it's an interesting concept. Regardless, we know the Federation must exist based on information from future episodes, and this does not actually contradict anything in the older episode to any greater extent or degree. It just means that there is another Federation which happens to be called the First Federation. Mud's Woman is the 6th episode of Season 1. It was the 4th episode produced. Its stardate is 1329.8 and its original air date was 13th of October 1966. During the episode, the Enterprise is chasing a Class J cargo ship. This is of minimal historical significance, but technically interesting. An image of what we think the ship looked like is in the top right corner. Spock states, "Sensor reading on the vessel. I make it out as a small Class J cargo ship, and the engines are superheating." While lithium crystals were first mentioned in episode 3, where no man has gone before, it is a major plot point in this episode. The Enterprise uses between 4 and 6 lithium crystals, and they are essential to the ship's power system. When the lithium crystals fail, the ship has to run on battery power. This is the second time the Enterprise finds itself in this situation. I'm unsure why they do not have spares. Of course, at a later date, this changes to dilithium. Zulu states, "That is one of our lithium crystal circuits, sir. Another lithium circuit, now supplementing with battery power, sir." Scott then later states to Kirk, "I don't know, sir. With those 3 lithium crystals gone, 1 lithium crystal left, and with a hairline split at the base." Later, Kirk states to Scotty, "Just hang us in long enough to get 6 crystals, Scotty. That's all we need." For the first time, this episode mentions Spock's race, which is stated as Vulcanian. The lack of emotion is also noted. Mudd states to Spock, "You're part Vulcanian, aren't you?" "Ah, well then, a pretty face doesn't affect you at all, does it? That is, unless you want it to. You can save it, girls. This type can turn himself off for any emotion." In this episode, we first hear of lithium mining stations, which in this case is not automated, as manned by miners. The girls are human and are searching for husbands, so the men on the mining stations are human. The station must be an Earth mining planet. It's interesting how Kirk does not have much authority over the miners, but this could be due to the urgency on Kirk's side, so he does not have time to enforce his authority. The mining station is called Rigel 12. Spock states, "There's a lithium mining operation on Rigel 12. High-grade ore, I've heard." Kirk replies, "Make for Rigel 12, Mr. Spock." Spock then states, "Rigel 12, Mr. Farrell, you have the course." The episode also mentions another planet, in this Ophiuchus 3. This is a planet which has settlers and is on the frontiers, so it's probably a colony planet. Mudd states, "Planet Ophiuchus 3, wiving settlers. You see, gentlemen, just as I've told you, these 3 lovely ladies designed for frontier planets to be the companions of lonely men, to supply the warmth of a human touch that's so desperately needed. A wife, a home, a family. Gentlemen, I look upon this work as a sacred public trust. I've devoted me whole life to it." There are 3 more planets mentioned in this episode, but none are named. One is a pelagic planet, which means it's mainly covered by water. Another is a helium experimental station on it. And the last is an automated farming planet. All would have been Earth planets, as the 3 girls are all human. Mud states, well, of course. Now, for example, Ruthie here comes from a pelagic planet, sea ranches. Magda hit there from a helium experimental station. Eva adds, it's the same story for all of us, Captain. No men. Mine was a farm planet with automated machines for company and 2 brothers to cook for, mend their clothes, cannel mud a foot thick on their boots every time they walked in. During this episode, Kirk offers to pay for the lithium crystals, which means the world of Star Trek uses currency, at least the TOS world. Childress states, let's get right to business. You want lithium crystals and we've got them. Kirk replies, fine, I'm authorised to pay an equitable price. In summary, what we learn in this episode is that the lithium crystals are used to power the Enterprise, and this is confirmed for a second time. We do learn there is something called auxiliary impulse engines, which could be small impulse engines used for emergency. We finally learn Spock's race, which is Vulcanian. During this episode, a lot of planets are listed. Rigel 12 is a mining planet. Ophiuchus 3 is a frontier planet with settlers. Not named are the three planets the girls come from. One is a farming, one is a research, and one is a planet covered by water. All are inhabited by very few humans and are mainly automated. Finally, we learn the world of Star Trek uses some form of currency or payment. It may not be physical money, but a currency can be used to buy lithium crystals, and this does exist. While by the time of the Next Generation currency could be obsolete, it's unlikely, so that the Next Gen episode, which describes a federation with no currency, is probably not the world we live in at the present moment, at least the Next Generation, or the original series anyway. The Enemy Within is the 5th episode of Season 1. It was the 5th episode produced. Its stardate is 1672.1 and its original air date was the 6th of October 1966. In this episode, the crew are exploring planet Alpha 177. The planet appears uninhabited and during the night the temperatures drop a lot. Captain's log, stardate 1672.1. Specimen gathering mission on planet Alpha 177. Unknown to any of us during this time, a duplicate of me, some strange alter ego, has been created by the transporter malfunction. Kirk later states, we can't leave those 4 men down there. It's getting dark. They'll die. The surface temperature of that planet goes down to 120 degrees below zero at night. During this episode, we finally see a hand phaser. The hand phaser can be set to stun or to kill. Kirk states, yes, that's right, we don't know, but the men have to be armed. The men are to be armed with their phasers locked. I repeat, locked on setting number 1. There can't be any chance of him being killed. He's to be taken without. If the men are forced to fire, he can't be killed. Spock replies. About the phaser weapons to be set for stunning force and locked. Later, Spock says, set and locked on base cycle to stun, not to kill. What about your phaser, Captain? Don't you think we ought to get some help, Captain? During this episode, Spock uses the Vulcan neck pinch for the first time, although it has no name in this episode. Other Kirk states, I don't know, I don't need you. Spock then comes up behind the other Kirk and neck pinches him, and Kirk's phaser fires, hits the panel instead. Thus, in summary, we do not have a shuttle in this episode, only the transporter. Another planet is disclosed, although this is uninhabited and no value for colonisation, but perhaps useful for mining. The hand phaser is shown for the first time, and Spock's neck pinch is also shown for the first time. The Man Trap is the 2nd episode of Season 1. It was the 6th episode produced. Its stardate is 1513.1, and its original air date was the 8th of September 1966. During this episode, for the very first time, the term Vulcan was used rather than Vulcanian as used previously. We also know Vulcan does not have a moon. Uhuru says to Spock, no, you have an answer? I'm an illogical woman who's beginning to feel too much part of that communications console. Why don't you tell me I'm an attractive young lady or ask me if I've ever been in love? Tell me how your planet Vulcan looks on a lazy evening when the moon is full. Spock replies, a Vulcan has no moon, Miss Uhuru. During this episode, the planet M113 is mentioned. This is uninhabited, but once hosted a civilization, which is long dead. It's assumed that this civilization never achieved spaceflight, and it looks like it never reached a high level of technology. But this is all assumption, and the episode provides almost no information about the civilization. I think this is a real lost opportunity. The ruins look like they could be 5,000 years old, but this is a wild guess based on the remastered version of this Star Trek episode. Captain's log, stardate 1513.1. Our position, orbiting planet M113. On board the Enterprise, Mr. Spock, temporarily in command. On the planet, the ruins of an ancient and long-dead civilization. Ship's surgeon, McCoy, and myself are now beaming down to the planet's surface. Our mission, routine medical examination of archaeologist Robert Crater and his wife Nancy. Routine, but for the fact that Nancy Crater is the one woman in Dr. McCoy's past. The episode also mentions another planet, which is called Wrigley, is a pleasure planet. As the creature adopts the form of one of the women from the planet, and the crewmen probably took advantage of the pleasures of the planet, we can safely assume it's inhabited by humans and is probably an Earth-controlled planet. It's almost certainly not a colony, but may be owned by a single individual or company. I wonder if the Wrigleys is linked to the chewing gum company. Darnell states, "Excuse me, sir, but ma'am, if I didn't know better, I could have sworn you were someone I left behind on Wrigley's pleasure planet. It's funny, you're exactly like a girl that..." He trails off. During this episode, the Enterprise is called a Starship for the second time. The first time it was mentioned is Season 1, Episode 6, which is Mud's Woman. Kirks states, quote, "All research personnel on alien planets are required to have their health certified by a Starship surgeon at 1-year intervals. Like it or not, Professor, as commander of the Starship, I'm required." For the first time, we learn that Spock's blood is different from that of humans. Spock states, "Fortunately, my ancestors spawned in another ocean than yours did. My blood cells are quite different." So in summary, during this episode, the term Vulcan is used for the first time, which is the name of the planet that Spock came from. Vulcan does not have a moon, which means that the Star Trek reboot displays another era. There are ancient dead civilizations within the bounds of the territory controlled by Earth. We learn of a pleasure planet, which is probably a human planet which specialises in providing recreation or pleasure, possibly even privately owned. The term Starship is used for a second time. We are uncertain if it describes all spacecraft or only large ones such as the Enterprise. Prior to this, Earthship was most often used. Spock's blood is different from human blood, which saves Spock's life. Another indication he is alien. The picture of Spock shows the blood being green. And so we come to an end of this video. As we've seen, many of the later Star Trek movies and shows do not align with the original vision of the series. This is common in real history, as later historians attempt to change the past in order to justify their beliefs in this present. As I personally enjoyed the original vision of Star Trek, I would hope future material would come back to its original roots. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.